Hi, it's Anastasia here, and today we're going to talk about inflection on the harpsichord. And now the word inflection is usually a term that is used in connection with speech rather than music. But the Baroque music was in fact very much tied to speech. And before I get into all that, I'm just going to briefly talk about the Baroque aesthetic. The word Baroque actually comes from the word that means misshapen pearl, and as a result, Baroque music is actually incredibly florid, very embellished, very exuberant, and very vital music that was very bass driven and very driven by hierarchy as well. You know, there was a big difference between strong beats and weak beats, and strong measures and weak measures, and all that. And in that light, it seems to be a bit of a puzzle sometimes to think that the primary keyboard instrument that was used during the Baroque period was one that had such a primitive function and couldn't produce big dynamic variety. And so how is it that this instrument is the one that is used to be a vehicle for all that exuberance and liveliness and all that groove? And the answer lies in inflection. And if you think about speech, just using speech as an analogy, when we talk, unless we're shouting or whispering, the volume of our voice pretty much stays the same the whole time. We use the same volume to express all kinds of emotions, from happiness to sadness to anger and fear or hesitancy, reticence, everything. And we don't actually need to change the volume of our voice very much in order to express all that we need to express with it. And so, and it's the same with the harpsichord. Its volume stays the same, but by making inflections and highlighting strong and weak beats, the music just absolutely comes alive and communicates in a way that a great oratory would. And so I just like to have a look at these two pieces of music here. Now, the Baroque music has sometimes gotten a bit of a bad rep for being square and just unexpressive and very sort of almost like dry mathematics. And for example, if you look at this urtext edition of a prelude by Bach, you'll see that all you really get is notes. There are absolutely no dynamic markings, no phrasing, no articulation, no slurs, no staccati, no nothing. And compare that with a score by Beethoven, where he writes everything in. There's dynamics, there are very, very precise slurrings, very precise articulation markings. And the mistake that we can sometimes make is to forget that these two composers were working in two very, very different times. And for Beethoven, we say, if he didn't write it in, it means he didn't want it. So, and if we use that logic on Bach, that would almost imply that we don't use any kind of we don't use any kind of expression at all, because he didn't write anything in. And that is absolutely not the way to go about interpreting Bach. And again, to show how language is such a useful tool for unlocking the key to Baroque music, I'm going to talk briefly about the International Phonetic Alphabet. So the International Phonetic Alphabet is basically a set of symbols used by languages all over the world to describe how certain words are supposed to be pronounced. So they're very precise symbols that show the kind of vowel, that vowel shape, and it delineates it shows which syllables are to be stressed and which are to be unstressed. And if you want to see how it looks, just look up any dictionary and have a look at the pronunciation guide. It's extremely precise. And so using that as an inspiration for this, I want you to, whenever you look at an Urtext score, to consider what you are seeing, not the IPA, but simply the written word. I'll give you a very simple example. So for the word harpsichord, we know it's made out of 3 syllables, and by virtue of being English language speakers, we know that the stress on the first syllable. We never, we don't look at the word and pronounce it harpsichord, because we know that the first syllable is stressed and the other 2 aren't stressed. But there's nothing in the spelling of harpsichord that's telling us that we're not reading IPA with it. There's no little stroke there to indicate to us which syllable is stressed, but we know which syllable is stressed, and we say harpsichord and not harpsichord, simply by virtue of being English language speakers and operating in this system. And so, just using that analogy, when I look at a piece of music like this and I see these groups of 16th notes, even though they are technically all of equal length, because I have, as it were, familiarized myself with the IPA of Baroque music, the performance practice of Baroque music, I know that there's a certain hierarchy that is guiding the performance of these 4 seemingly equal notes. So I know that just because I see 4 16 notes in a row, it doesn't mean that they are all of equal importance. And as I said earlier, Baroque music is extremely driven by hierarchy, and that hierarchy in turn directs or helps shape how I inflect that group of equal value notes. I'd like to give you a little example now. This is a little phrase in 4/4 time with 3 16th notes as a pickup, that measure line. So 16th note, 4 16th notes in beat 1, and then this is beat 2. So if we were to play it the way it's notated, no articulation markings, no differentiation, it would sound like this. And on the harpsichord, it's because there's no you can't do any kind of dynamics with it. It's hard to tell where the pulse is. I can't tell whether where the bar line is, whether I start on an upbeat or a downbeat. It just all becomes it just sounds like a string of notes or it sounds very typewriterish, and it's hard to get any sense of the pulse, and it's really difficult for the audience, the listeners, to understand what you're trying to communicate to them. So in order to do that, we need to play with articulation. So the first order of business is to make sure that how we talked about that hierarchy. 1 and then 3, and then 2 and 4. So that would, and by that logic, 1 is always the most important beat. So we want to make sure that our first order of business is to make sure that the listeners can tell what's an upbeat and what's a downbeat and where the measure line is. And in order to do that, we use another instrument of speech. I talked about words, and now I'm going to talk about sentences, and how sentences have their own kind of inflection and rhythm, and how you don't. This is something that also one cannot see on written, in the written word. This sort of the natural push that we have towards the middle of the sentence, and the falling of the voice towards the end of the sentence, and one thing that we do often in speech is that we use rhetorical pauses before giving away important information. Like if you're telling a joke, or you're trying to tell someone, you're trying to give them very, very, life-threatening, important information, you always take a rhetorical pause before that information, or before the punchline of your joke, to make sure that you have your listeners' attention. And so similarly, we want to add a tiny little rhetorical pause before beat 1, so that the listener knows, this is an important beat. And how do we create that rhetorical pause? You can't just insert time anywhere, because that will throw your tempo off. And we do that by shaving away time from the previous notes. So even though I have 3/16 notes before my downbeat, I'm actually almost thinking of the last 16th note as a 30-second note with a 30-second pause. So inserting that rhetorical pause, this is what it sounds like now. So that's already a bit clear. And now, so that's cleared up, but it still doesn't quite hit you in the face yet. And as we all know, as musicians, whenever we want to do a gesture or phrase, it just has to be that much bigger, especially when you're performing in big spaces, so that your gesture will carry to the end of the hall. So, what we have to do in order to make that we've made the first beat important, but then if you listen carefully, the 4/16 notes which constitute the first beat of that measure all sound exactly the same. And the result of that is that the weaker beats, the 16 notes that actually need to be weaker, as well as beat 2, end up sounding louder than the downbeat, and so we have this weak 1 and this heavy 2, which obviously does not fly. So now that we've established that rhetorical pause before beat 1, so we've modified things on the front side, we also need to modify things on the back side of that beat, and we do that by making the 16th note that follows as soft as possible. So, as opposed to... So how do we make that second 16th note as quiet as possible? And this is where finger legato comes in, over legato, finger pedal. And the logic behind this is that the harpsichord sound is divided into 3 distinct parts. You have the initial pluck, the bloom, and then the schlup sound when the jack falls back into the harpsichord, and it's the attack that actually makes something sound loud. And so when we want a sound to be extremely soft, what we do is we don't lift the finger of the previous note until the second note has been plucked, and in that way the initial attack of the second note, which is the thing that would make it sound loud, is hidden within the resonance of the previous note, because the previous note is still resonating. So this is especially important when you have when you're resolving dissonances into consonances, like when you have an appoggiatura and the resolution needs to be softer than the suspension. So and if you don't do finger pedal, this is what it sounds like. Notice how the resolution sounds louder than the suspension, and that obviously harmonically doesn't make sense. So we want to use finger pedal. So going back to our example of by finger pedaling the second 16th note of the downbeat, we make it very soft, and then so you have over legato here, and then to continue that that diminuendo, because in terms of the 4/16th notes within even that first beat, the fourth of those 16 notes has to be the least important. So to continue that diminuendo, what we can do is use a more detached, almost staccato like, just a little crispier plucking in our articulation. So this is your downbeat, over legato, and then staccato. See, that's immediately a lot more rhetorical and a lot more a lot more transparent, a lot lighter, and we hear these four 16 notes in their proper context, because it's just a play on G major. It's just an arpeggio. It's just a color, and we don't need, especially if the piece is just a string of 16th notes. We don't want them all to sound equal, because that's when the harpsichord starts sounding like a typewriter or a sewing machine. But with all this differentiations, our ears are drawn to the important notes, and can identify which ones are integral to the harmony and which ones are just plays on that harmony or embellishments. And then of course beat 2 is also it's a weaker beat compared to beat 1, but because this is it also depends on the tempo, and this is because it has so many 16th notes, the tempo of the big beats is actually quite small. So compared to the 16th notes that came before it, this quarter note on the second beat is actually quite important. So we would articulate before, again putting a rhetorical pause before it and shaving off time, which actually works really well because we want the fourth 16th note to be as light as possible. So what happens here by having many different types of articulation. So we have just a regular touch, and then here will be a shaving off time, and then this would be an exception where our fingers can be airborne to give it a nice accent. And then we have over legato, and then we have staccato, and then we have a light landing point. And you know, even within those 8 notes, we have 4 different articulations, and that's exactly what's needed. And together with a good pluck, resonance sound, you'll start to find that the harpsichord just comes alive and isn't just this bright wall of sound that you would wish would stop. And so that's all I have for today. I would encourage you to play around with these things that I've shown you, and I hope that you will find that this instrument is actually one of the most beautiful and expressive instruments in the world. Thank you.